I never thought I'd be the kind of man who'd lose everything at 63. My name is Arthur, and 40 years ago, I walked into Chicago with nothing but a construction certificate and a hunger to build something real. By the time I turned 60, I owned 3 rental properties across the North Side, 2 restored classic cars, and an investment portfolio worth just over $8 million. I wasn't rich by Chicago standards, but I'd earned every dollar with my hands, my head, and my integrity. Then Vanessa asked for a divorce. We'd been married 35 years. I thought we'd grown distant, sure, but I figured that's what happened after decades together. I agreed to split things fairly. I even suggested mediation to keep it civil for our kids, Sophia and Lucas. That's when she introduced me to Sebastian, her new boyfriend. He was an attorney. My attorney, she insisted. He'd help us navigate everything smoothly. I should have known better. A man doesn't survive 4 decades in real estate without learning to read people. But I was tired, heartbroken, and too proud to admit I needed help. So I signed where Sebastian told me to sign. 6 months later, I was living in a 1-bedroom apartment in Cicero with peeling paint and a radiator that clanked all night. Vanessa had the houses. Sebastian had liquidated my portfolio. Together they'd taken everything, and somehow, according to the court documents, I'd committed fraud and emotional abuse. My own children believed it. They stopped returning my calls. The worst part wasn't the poverty. It was the invisibility. I'd watch the news and wonder if this is how you disappear. If you've ever felt like the world forgot you existed, stay with me. Because what happened next changed everything. And it started with a box I almost threw away. Winter in Chicago hits different when you can't afford heat. I spent most of January 2024 wrapped in every piece of clothing I owned, trying to decide which bills to ignore. The landlord wanted rent. The electric company sent a final notice. My stomach reminded me I'd been living on ramen and day-old bread from the discount bakery down the block. I was 70 pounds lighter than my wedding day, and not in a good way. The humiliation was worse than the hunger. I'd see former colleagues at the grocery store and watch them pretend not to recognize me. Nobody in Illinois real estate would hire Arthur Sterling anymore. Sebastian had made sure of that. Somehow rumors spread that I'd been investigated for property fraud, that I'd abused my wife, that my licenses were under review. None of it was true, but truth doesn't matter when a skilled attorney writes the narrative. I thought about calling Sophia or Lucas 100 times, but what would I say? They'd already made their choice. At Thanksgiving, Sophia posted photos with her mother and Sebastian at some steakhouse downtown, the kind of place I used to take the family for celebrations. The caption said something about being grateful for honest people. That one hurt more than I want to admit. By February, I'd sold everything that had any value. My father's watch, my grandfather's war medals, the wedding ring Vanessa left on the kitchen counter. I was down to 3 boxes of personal items I couldn't bear to part with, though I wasn't sure why I was holding on. Memories don't pay rent. That's when I found the cigar box. It was at the bottom of the last box, wrapped in an old newspaper from 1948. I recognized it immediately. My grandfather Henry's Romeo y Julieta box, the fancy kind he'd bought himself after his construction company landed its first big contract. Inside were letters, old photos of him and his work clothes, and a small brown booklet I almost missed. A savings passbook. First National Bank of Chicago. Account opened April 15, 1948, in the name of Henry James Sterling. The last entry was a $50 deposit, dated June 1948. I stared at it for a long time. $50 in 1948 money, maybe worth a few hundred now. It wasn't much, but it might buy groceries for a couple weeks. At that point, I would have walked through fire for a hot meal. The next morning I put on my only suit. It hung loose on my frame like I was a kid playing dress-up in my father's clothes. I took 2 buses to the bank's downtown branch, the same building my grandfather probably walked into 76 years ago. The marble floors and high ceilings made me feel even smaller than I already did. The young teller looked at the passbook like I'd handed her a museum artifact. She called over a manager. He called over a supervisor. Then someone in a suit I couldn't afford led me to a private office. The wait felt like hours. Through the glass walls, I could see them typing on computers, making phone calls, having urgent conversations I couldn't hear. My heart hammered. Maybe the account was flagged. Maybe there was some fee I couldn't pay. Maybe I'd somehow broken a law by even bringing this in. Finally, the branch director entered. He was my age, maybe older, with gray at his temples and reading glasses on a chain. He sat down across from me and looked at the passbook, then at me, then back at the passbook. His hands were shaking slightly. That's when I knew something was very, very wrong. The director's voice came out barely above a whisper. He told me the account had never been closed. For 76 years it had sat there, accumulating compound interest at rates that don't exist anymore, automatically reinvested into dividend-yielding stocks through some program the bank had discontinued decades ago. The numbers he showed me didn't make sense at first. Too many zeros. $127 million. I actually laughed. It was the kind of laugh that comes out when your brain can't process reality anymore. The director thought I was having a breakdown and offered me water. I waved him off, still staring at the computer screen, trying to make the number change into something reasonable. But it didn't change. He handed me a sealed envelope that had been stored with the account documents, my grandfather's handwriting on the front, for Arthur or his father if I don't make it. Inside was a letter written in the shaky script of an old man who knew his time was running out. My grandfather explained everything. Back in 1947, his business partners had tried to force him out of his own company through a scheme that involved forged contracts and manufactured debts. He'd fought back, won, and bought them out. But the experience taught him something about human nature and greed. He'd started this account as a safety net, a war chest hidden from everyone, including his own wife. He wanted future generations to have a weapon if they ever faced the same betrayal. The last line hit me like a hammer. Revenge is an empty plate. Use this to rebuild, not just to destroy. But remember, money visible makes you a target. Money invisible makes you invincible. I sat in that office until the bank closed, just thinking. When I finally walked out into the Chicago evening, the city looked different. The same people rushed past me to catch trains, the same wind cut through the buildings, but I wasn't the same man who had walked in that morning. For the first time in months, I felt something other than despair. It was cold, sharp, and focused. I went back to my apartment and made 3 decisions before I slept that night. First, I would tell absolutely no one about this money, not my children, not anyone. As far as the world was concerned, Arthur Sterling was still broke, still broken, still forgotten. Second, I would use a portion of this to hire the kind of legal help that Sebastian never saw coming, not a local attorney who played by Chicago rules, but someone from New York who specialized in exposing corrupt lawyers and fabricated evidence. Third, I would dig. I'd spent 40 years in real estate learning to read documents, trace ownership, and spot irregularities. I'd apply every skill I had to figure out exactly what Sebastian and Vanessa had done, and I'd find the proof that would bring them down. But even as I planned, my grandfather's words echoed in my head. Rebuild, not just destroy. I thought about Sophia and Lucas, about the grandchildren I hadn't been allowed to meet, about the life I'd built before it all fell apart. Revenge alone wouldn't fix what was broken. Still, there's a time for rebuilding, and there's a time to make sure the people who burned your house down can't ever strike a match again. I started my research the next morning, found Jonathan Wright's name within a week. Jonathan Wright didn't come cheap. But then again, I wasn't paying by the hour anymore. His office in Manhattan occupied an entire floor of a building where the security alone probably cost more than my old annual salary. He was younger than I expected, maybe 45, with the kind of sharp eyes that missed nothing. When I finished explaining my situation over secure video call, he didn't react with sympathy or outrage. He simply nodded and asked if I was prepared for what we might find. I told him I'd spent 6 months losing everything. I could handle the truth. He assigned a team of forensic accountants, investigators, and paralegals who'd spent their careers dismantling cases built on lies. Within 3 weeks, they'd pulled Sebastian's entire professional history. What they found made my blood run cold. Sebastian Mitchell wasn't just unethical. He was a professional predator. Over 15 years, he'd represented wealthy clients going through divorces, then systematically extracted their assets through fabricated evidence, forged documents, and strategic manipulation of family members. My case wasn't an anomaly. It was his specialty. The investigators found 7 other men who'd lost everything to Sebastian's schemes, and in 4 of those cases, he'd ended up in a relationship with his client's ex-wife after the divorce was finalized. Vanessa wasn't his first. She was his 8th. The pattern was surgical. He'd identify wealthy men going through marital problems, offer legal services, gain their trust, then flip everything. He fabricated abuse claims, manufactured financial improprieties, and turned children against their fathers with carefully edited recordings and selectively presented evidence. The men were usually too broken to fight back effectively by the time they realized what happened. But here's what made Sebastian dangerous. He was meticulous. His forgeries were nearly perfect. His fabricated evidence held up under initial scrutiny. He knew exactly which judges to file with, which delays to request, which motions would bury his opponents under legal costs they couldn't afford. Jonathan's team found something else, though. Sebastian had gotten sloppy with success. Some of his document manipulations used the same editing software watermarks. Some of his notary stamps didn't match official records, and in my case specifically, there was a signed affidavit from a witness who claimed to have seen me commit financial fraud on a date when my cell phone records, bank records, and building security footage proved I was 300 miles away at a real estate conference. Jonathan called it an exploitable gap. I called it the crack in Sebastian's armor. Meanwhile, I kept living in that Cicero apartment. I wore the same threadbare clothes. I bought groceries with cash and budgeted like I was still broke. I needed everyone, especially Vanessa and Sebastian, to believe I was finished. Broken men don't fight back. Broken men don't have the resources to hire Manhattan attorneys or forensic accountants. I became invisible by choice this time. But while I was invisible, I started learning things about my children I hadn't known. Jonathan's investigators weren't just looking into Sebastian. They were mapping out everything, including how my absence had affected Sophia and Lucas. Sophia was struggling at her marketing job. Her boss, some middle-aged executive with a reputation for harassment, had her working 80-hour weeks and making inappropriate comments that HR conveniently ignored. She'd lost weight. Her social media posts, which I still checked from a fake account, showed someone trying desperately to appear happy while clearly falling apart. Lucas had taken out a predatory loan to keep his small carpentry business afloat. He was 3 months from bankruptcy, drowning in interest payments to lenders who specialized in targeting struggling small business owners. The business he'd built from nothing, the same way I'd built mine 40 years ago, was dying. And Vanessa? She was living in my old Lincoln Park house with Sebastian, posting photos of expensive dinners and weekend trips to Napa Valley. My money funding their lifestyle while my children suffered. That's when I made another decision, one my grandfather probably would have understood. I had more than enough resources now to hurt Sebastian and Vanessa legally. But I also had enough to help my children, even if they didn't know it was me. Even if they'd turned their backs when I needed them most. Because that's what fathers do. We protect our children even when they don't deserve it. Jonathan helped me set up 2 shell corporations, untraceable back to me. Through one, I purchased the marketing firm where Sophia worked. Within a week, her boss was terminated for cause. Through the other, I became an anonymous angel investor in Lucas's business, injecting enough capital to pay off his predatory loans and cover 6 months of operating expenses. They'd never know it was me, but I'd know. And somehow that was enough for now. The real fight, though, was just beginning. Because Sebastian had made one critical mistake in his confidence. He'd kept digital records of everything, and Jonathan's team had found a way in. The breakthrough came on a Tuesday afternoon in April. Jonathan's lead forensic analyst, a woman named Dr. Patricia Chen, who'd testified in over 200 fraud cases, called me directly instead of going through Jonathan. Her voice had an edge of excitement that professionals usually try to hide. She'd cracked Sebastian's encrypted backup drive. Attorneys, especially ones who make their living through deception, tend to keep insurance files, evidence of their own crimes stored securely as leverage if clients or partners ever turn against them. Sebastian was no different. He'd maintained detailed records of every scheme, every forged document, every manipulated witness statement. Not out of stupidity, but out of narcissism. He believed he was too smart to ever be caught. Dr. Chen walked me through what she'd found. Sebastian had created a template system for his fraud operations, standard affidavits with blanks to fill in, Photoshop files showing layers of document manipulation, email chains with notaries who'd stamp anything for $200, even recordings of him coaching ex-wives on what to say in divorce proceedings, how to cry on cue, which phrases triggered the most sympathy from judges. My case had its own folder. Everything was there. The fabricated abuse timeline, the forged financial documents showing me hiding assets, the coaching sessions where Sebastian taught Vanessa how to play the victim. There was even a spreadsheet tracking my assets and how they'd be divided once the divorce finalized. But the file that made my hands shake was labeled Post-Acquisition Strategy. Sebastian had written out, in detail, how he planned to maintain control over my properties and investments long term. He'd positioned himself as Vanessa's financial advisor, taking a percentage of everything. He'd specifically noted that my children would eventually inherit these assets, and he'd already drafted plans to become their attorney when that happened, positioning himself to extract another generation's worth of wealth. My family wasn't just a score to Sebastian. We were a long-term revenue stream. Jonathan filed motions immediately, but carefully. We couldn't tip our hand too early. Sebastian had connections throughout the Illinois legal system. If he knew we had this evidence before we were ready to strike, he'd destroy records, intimidate witnesses, and disappear into the legal gray zones he'd operated in for years. So we built the case slowly, methodically, contacted the other 7 men Sebastian had defrauded. 4 were willing to testify once they heard someone was finally fighting back. We gathered banking records, phone records, property records. We identified every forged document, every bribed notary, every manipulated witness, and we waited for the perfect moment. Meanwhile, life in Cicero continued. I'd see neighbors, and they'd nod politely, these quiet older folks who worked hard and asked for nothing. They treated me with more dignity than the people I'd once called friends. One woman, Mrs. Rodriguez from 3B, started leaving plates of food by my door. She never said anything, just left them there with a note that said extras. We both knew she'd made them specifically for me, but she understood about pride. I thought about my grandfather a lot during those months. He'd fought his own battle against betrayal and won, but then he'd hidden his victory, storing away his war chest for future generations. I wondered if he'd felt this same cold determination, this sense that some fights aren't just about winning, they're about making sure the same predators can't hurt anyone else. By June, we had everything we needed. Jonathan ran through the evidence list one final time. 47 forged documents, 19 falsified affidavits, 8 manipulated witnesses, 12 instances of notary fraud, and 1 prosecutor in the Northern District of Illinois, who'd been waiting years for enough evidence to bring down Sebastian Mitchell. The prosecutor's name was Rebecca Torres. She'd watched Sebastian operate in her district for over a decade, winning cases that shouldn't have been won, destroying people who didn't deserve to be destroyed. But Sebastian was careful. He never crossed the line quite enough for her to act until now. When Jonathan showed her what we had, she actually smiled. It wasn't a happy smile. It was the smile of someone who'd been sharpening a knife for years and finally found something to cut. She told us to give her 2 weeks to coordinate with the FBI's Financial Crimes Division and prepare arrest warrants. Everything had to be simultaneous. Sebastian, Vanessa as a co-conspirator, and 3 notaries who'd enabled his fraud ring. If even one person got advance warning, they'd all scatter. Those 2 weeks felt longer than the previous 6 months. I walked through Chicago knowing that my life was about to change again, but this time I was the one controlling the change. Every morning, I'd check my phone expecting Jonathan to tell me something had gone wrong. Every night I'd lie awake thinking about what would happen when the truth finally came out. I thought about my children too. Sophia and Lucas would learn that everything they believed about me was a lie, that they'd abandoned their father based on fabricated evidence. Part of me wanted them to suffer that knowledge. Part of me just wanted them back. But there was no going back to who we were before. The best I could hope for was building something new from the ruins. The call came on a Thursday morning. Rebecca Torres, Jonathan, and a FBI Special Agent conference lined together. The operation was scheduled for the following evening during Vanessa and Sebastian's anniversary party, a black tie event at the Peninsula Hotel celebrating 1 year together. They were going to arrest him in front of everyone he'd tried to impress. In front of Vanessa, wearing jewelry purchased with money stolen from me. In front of Chicago's legal community, who'd either enabled him or looked the other way. Sometimes revenge isn't empty. Sometimes it's justice wearing a tuxedo. While we waited for the arrests, I did something I'd been planning since the day I found my grandfather's account. I started helping people. Jonathan had helped me set up a series of trusts and investment vehicles, all structured to be completely anonymous. Nobody could trace the money back to me. I was a ghost with a checkbook, and I intended to use it. The first person I helped was called James Patterson, one of Sebastian's previous victims. The investigators had tracked him down, living in a studio apartment in Gary, Indiana, working 2 jobs just to survive. Sebastian had taken his printing business, his house, and his relationship with his daughter 15 years ago. James was 71 now, too old to rebuild, too tired to fight. I bought his old printing business back from the company that currently owned it, then transferred it to a trust with James as the sole beneficiary, included enough capital to modernize the equipment and hire staff. Had a lawyer who'd never heard of me contact him with the news. Jonathan told me James cried when he heard. I didn't need to see it. I just needed to know one of Sebastian's victims got their life back. There were others. A man named Robert who'd lost his veterinary practice. A father of 3 who'd been forced into bankruptcy. Each one got a carefully structured intervention, an anonymous benefactor who asked for nothing except that they rebuild their lives. I thought about stopping there, about focusing my resources on Sebastian's previous victims, but then I'd check Sophia's social media and see her posts about struggling at work, about feeling overwhelmed, about not knowing if she could keep going. And I'd look at Lucas's business website, last updated 6 months ago, showing projects he'd never finished because he couldn't afford materials. They'd betrayed me. They'd chosen Vanessa's lies over everything I'd taught them about integrity and truth. They'd cut me out of their lives without even asking for my side of the story. But they were still my children. The marketing firm acquisition happened first. I didn't buy it to help Sophia initially. I bought it because it was undervalued and poorly managed, the kind of investment my grandfather would have recognized as smart business. But once I owned it, once I saw the HR reports about her boss and his pattern of harassment, the decision was easy. I had him fired, promoted Sophia to senior director with a salary increase, created a hostile work environment task force so no other employee would face what she had. And I did it all through my Shell Corporation's board of directors, people who'd never met me and only knew me as a voice on conference calls. Sophia posted about her promotion, called it a miracle, said she'd been praying for change and finally the universe delivered. I almost commented from my fake account. Almost told her the universe had nothing to do with it, that her father was still looking out for her even when she thought he'd abandoned her. But I didn't. She wasn't ready for that truth yet. Lucas's business was trickier. Small carpentry operations don't usually attract angel investors. But I structured it as a community development investment, part of a broader portfolio supporting local craftsmanship. Paid off his predatory loans, established a line of credit with reasonable terms, and set him up with a business consultant who could help him scale operations sustainably. The consultant reported back that Lucas was talented, but overwhelmed, trying to do everything himself because he didn't trust anyone after watching his family fall apart. The observation hurt more than I expected. I wanted to tell him that trust, once broken, can be rebuilt. That I understood his caution because I'd learned it from my own father, who'd learned it from his father before him. That the Sterling men had always been careful with our hearts, even when we were generous with our hands. But those conversations would have to wait. First came justice, then came truth. Then, maybe, came forgiveness. The week before the arrests, I did one more thing. I visited my old properties, the ones Vanessa and Sebastian had taken, drove past the Lincoln Park house where I'd raised my children, now occupied by the people who'd destroyed my life. Walked by the rental properties I'd renovated with my own hands, now managed by Sebastian's property company. I didn't feel the anger I'd expected, just a cold certainty that these places would be mine again soon. The law would return what had been stolen. The only question was what I'd do with it all afterward. That's when I thought about my grandfather's final instruction. Rebuild, not just destroy. I'd spent months focused on destruction, gathering evidence, building cases, preparing for Sebastian's downfall. But I hadn't thought much about what came after. What does a 63-year-old man do with $127 million and 3 stolen years of his life? The answer came to me standing outside the Lincoln Park house, watching lights move behind the windows where my children once lived. I'd build something that mattered, something that would help other men facing what I'd faced, fighting systems designed to protect predators like Sebastian. But first, I had to watch those predators fall. Jonathan called Thursday night with final confirmation. Everything was set. Federal agents, state prosecutors, Chicago PD to manage the scene. The arrests would happen at 9 p.m. Friday, right after dinner service at the anniversary party. I asked if I needed to be there. He said no, but I could watch if I wanted. They'd have surveillance set up across the street. I told him I'd be there. I'd spent 6 months invisible. I wanted to watch Sebastian see me one last time before his world ended. That night, I ironed my old suit. It still hung loose, but I'd gained some weight back. Mrs. Rodriguez's food had helped. I looked at myself in the bathroom mirror and saw my grandfather's eyes staring back. The same determination. The same understanding that some battles aren't about revenge. They're about protecting everyone who comes after you. 24 hours until everything changed again. Friday evening, I stood across the street from the Peninsula Hotel wearing a borrowed coat and my father's old dress shoes. The surveillance van was parked 2 blocks away, but Jonathan had arranged for me to watch from a coffee shop with a clear view of the hotel entrance. I sat by the window with a cold cup of coffee, watching Chicago's legal elite arrive in town cars and taxis, women in evening gowns, men in tuxedos. Everyone dressed up to celebrate the love story of Vanessa Sterling and Sebastian Mitchell. I recognized faces, lawyers I'd hired for property deals, judges who'd ruled against me in the divorce, former friends who'd stopped returning calls after my reputation collapsed. They walked past the hotel's doorman, laughing. completely unaware that federal agents were already positioned inside. Vanessa arrived at 7:30. She stepped out of a black Mercedes wearing a red dress I'd never seen before, probably cost more than 3 months of my current rent. She looked happy, confident, like a woman who'd escaped a terrible situation and found her soulmate. Sebastian emerged from the other side of the car in a perfectly tailored tuxedo, offered his arm, and they walked inside together. For just a moment, I felt something crack inside my chest. Not heartbreak exactly, more like the final breaking of whatever connection had survived the past year. I'd loved that woman for 35 years, built a life with her, and she'd helped destroy me without a second thought. Jonathan's voice crackled through the earpiece he'd given me. The FBI team was in position. Rebecca Torres had arrived with the arrest warrants. Chicago PD had secured the exits. They were just waiting for my signal. I'd asked for that courtesy, not because I needed control, but because I needed to see Sophia and Lucas before everything happened. They arrived together at 8 o'clock. My children, dressed for their mother's celebration, probably believing they were supporting her recovery from an abusive marriage. Sophia wore blue, Lucas a dark suit that made him look older than 28. They hugged Vanessa at the entrance, posed for photos with her and Sebastian, smiled like families do. I watched through the coffee shop window and felt every year of my age. They looked so much like their mother. Sophia had Vanessa's smile. Lucas had her eyes. But they had my stubbornness, my work ethic, my tendency to trust too easily. That last one had nearly destroyed me. I wouldn't let it destroy them. At 8:45, I gave Jonathan the signal. 3 words. Let's finish this. I didn't watch the arrests from across the street. I walked into the Peninsula Hotel through the service entrance using credentials Jonathan had arranged, took the elevator to the ballroom level, and stood in the back hallway where I could see into the dining room without being seen. The party was exactly what I'd expected. Round tables with white linens, champagne flowing, a string quartet playing something classical I didn't recognize. Sebastian stood at the center table with Vanessa beside him, giving a speech about love, partnership, and new beginnings. People applauded. Then the ballroom doors opened, and federal agents walked in. Rebecca Torres led them, badge held high, voice carrying across the room. She identified herself as an assistant United States attorney and announced arrest warrants for Sebastian Mitchell and Vanessa Sterling on charges of conspiracy to commit fraud, falsification of documents, and theft by deception. The room went silent. You could have heard a napkin drop. Sebastian's face did something I'll never forget. It went from confident to confused to terrified in about 3 seconds. He started to argue, started using his lawyer voice to demand explanations and threaten lawsuits. But Rebecca just kept reading charges while 2 FBI agents moved toward him with handcuffs. Vanessa looked around the room like she was searching for an exit that didn't exist. She kept saying there had been a mistake, that she didn't understand, that someone needed to call their attorney. The irony of asking for an attorney when her attorney boyfriend was being arrested beside her would have been funny if it wasn't so pathetic. I watched them get handcuffed, watched Sebastian's face turn red with rage and humiliation, watched Vanessa's perfect makeup start running as she cried, watched every person in that ballroom pull out their phones to record the moment Chicago's predator lawyer got taken down. Then I looked at my children. Sophia had her hand over her mouth, tears streaming down her face. Lucas looked like he'd been punched in the stomach. They didn't understand. How could they? In their minds, their mother was the victim being arrested for crimes she didn't commit. Another injustice, another betrayal, another reason to hate a system that had already taken their father. I almost walked out to them then, almost stepped into that ballroom and told them everything. But Jonathan had warned me. They needed to hear the truth properly, in a controlled setting, with evidence they could examine. Springing it on them during their mother's arrest would just traumatize them further. So I stayed in the shadows and watched federal agents escort Vanessa and Sebastian out through the same doors they'd entered so confidently an hour before. Watched the guests scatter, conversation erupting, everyone with theories about what just happened. Watched Sophia and Lucas stand frozen at their table, holding on to each other like they were the only solid things left in the world. Then I left through the service exit and walked back to my Cicero apartment. The news hit social media before I made it home. Videos of the arrest, photos of Sebastian in handcuffs, speculation about charges. Someone had leaked that there were multiple victims, that this was a years-long fraud investigation, that Vanessa had been involved in falsifying evidence. Chicago's legal community was imploding in real time. My phone, the new one Jonathan had set up with a clean number, rang once. It was Rebecca Torres. She told me the arrests went smoothly. Both suspects were being processed. Based on the evidence, she expected multiple felony convictions with significant prison time. She also told me something I hadn't expected. When they'd searched Sebastian's office after the arrest, they'd found a file labeled Phase 2 that contained plans to go after my life insurance policies and pension funds. He'd been researching ways to have me declared legally incompetent so Vanessa could gain full control of any remaining assets. They'd planned to take everything, then take away my ability to ever fight back. I thanked Rebecca and ended the call. Sat in my apartment looking at the cigar box on the kitchen table, the one that had started everything, my grandfather's last gift, his hidden weapon against betrayal. He'd been right about invisible money making you invincible, but he'd also been right about revenge being empty. Watching Vanessa and Sebastian get arrested felt necessary, felt just, but it didn't feel satisfying the way I'd imagined. It just felt like closing a door that should have never been opened. The real question was what door I'd open next. My phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. I almost deleted it, but something made me open it. "Dad, I don't understand what's happening. Please call me." Sophia. I stared at those words for 20 minutes. My daughter, reaching out, finally asking for my side of the story, but I couldn't call, not yet. Not until Jonathan prepared the evidence presentation, not until she and Lucas could see everything Sebastian and Vanessa had done. I typed out a response. "Soon, I promise. I love you." Then I turned off my phone and tried to sleep, knowing the hardest conversation of my life was still coming. The meeting happened 3 days later in Jonathan's Chicago office. He'd rented a conference room at a downtown law firm, neutral territory, where Sophia and Lucas could examine evidence without feeling ambushed. I arrived early, hands shaking despite 2 cups of coffee and a pep talk from Mrs. Rodriguez, who'd somehow figured out something big was happening and told me to go get your babies back. Jonathan had prepared everything meticulously, 3 binders of evidence, 1 for each of us. Forensic reports, bank statements, the files from Sebastian's encrypted drive, transcripts of coaching sessions where he'd taught Vanessa what to say, video depositions from Sebastian's other victims, affidavits from the notaries who'd falsified documents, expert analysis of every forged signature, every manipulated photograph, every fabricated abuse claim. It was overwhelming. That was intentional. Jonathan wanted them to see the scope of what had been done, not just to me, but as a pattern of predatory behavior spanning 15 years. Sophia arrived first. She walked past me without recognition at first, probably because I'd gained back 30 pounds and was wearing a suit that actually fit. Then she stopped, turned, and our eyes met. "Dad!" Her voice cracked on the word. Lucas came in behind her and froze. They both just stood there, staring at me like I was a ghost, which, in a way, I had been. I wanted to hug them, wanted to tell them everything would be okay. But Jonathan stepped in smoothly, offered introductions, and guided everyone to seats before emotions could completely take over. We had work to do first. Understanding had to come before reconciliation. Jonathan began with a timeline, showed them when Sebastian had entered our lives, showed them the pattern of his previous cases, explained how attorney fraud works, how trusted professionals exploit the legal system's assumption of good faith. Then he walked them through the evidence, piece by piece, letting them examine everything themselves. I watched my children's faces as they read, watched confusion turn to shock, turn to horror, watched Sophia's hands tremble as she held transcripts of her mother coaching with Sebastian, watched Lucas's jaw clench as he read through the falsified abuse claims. The session took 4 hours. Nobody spoke much except to ask questions. Jonathan answered everything with calm professionalism, walking them through expert testimony, explaining legal terms, showing them how every piece connected. At one point, Sophia looked up from a binder and asked me directly, "Did you know she was planning this?" I told her the truth. I didn't know anything until it was done. I trusted the wrong people, including my own wife. Oskari, Lucas asked about the money. Why hadn't I fought harder, hired better lawyers, exposed the fraud earlier? I explained about being broke, about having my reputation destroyed, about how Sebastian had made sure nobody in Illinois would help me. I didn't mention my grandfather's account. That part of the story could wait. The breaking point came when Jonathan played audio recordings from Sebastian's encrypted files. His voice, clear and confident, explaining to someone on the phone how he'd secured another mark, and how Vanessa was playing her part perfectly. He talked about me like I was a business opportunity, not a human being. Talked about my children like they were leverage to be exploited later. Sophia started crying, not gentle tears, but the kind of sobbing that comes from realizing everything you believed was a lie. Lucas put his arm around her, but I could see his own tears, the way his face had gone red with rage and shame. I let them process. Jonathan had warned me this would be the hardest part. They'd spent a year believing their father was abusive, manipulative, and dishonest. Now they had to accept that their mother was all those things instead. That kind of cognitive dissonance breaks something in you. Finally, Sophia looked at me and asked the question I'd been dreading. "Can you forgive us?" I got up from my seat and crossed to where they were sitting, knelt down so I could look them both in the eyes the way I had when they were children. "There's nothing to forgive," I said. "Sebastian manipulated you with evidence that looked real. Your mother, someone you trusted more than anyone, confirmed his lies. You were victims too." "But we should have known," Lucas said. His voice was hoarse. "We should have questioned it, should have given you a chance to defend yourself." I thought about my grandfather's letter, about rebuilding versus destroying, about the difference between justice and revenge. "You're human," I told them. "Humans make mistakes. What matters is what you do after you know the truth." We talked for another hour. I explained about the anonymous help I'd given them, about buying Sophia's company and creating the opportunity for her promotion, about investing in Lucas's business and paying off his predatory loans. I told them I'd done it not because they deserved it after betraying me, but because I was their father and protecting them was my job regardless of what they'd done. Sophia asked why I hadn't told them sooner. I said because they needed to come to the truth on their own terms, to see the evidence and reach their own conclusions. If I'd just shown up claiming their mother was the villain, they'd have never believed me. They'd needed to see Sebastian fall first. Before we left, Lucas asked what happened next. Would I press charges against their mother? Would I try to recover the assets? Would I help testify against Sebastian? I told them the truth. Vanessa was facing federal charges. My attorney had filed motions to void the divorce on grounds of fraud. The properties and assets would be returned through legal processes, already in motion. Sebastian would likely spend a decade in federal prison. Everything that had been taken would be given back, not through my actions, but through the justice system working the way it was supposed to. "And after that?" Sophia asked. "After that," I said, "we figure out how to be a family again, if you want that." They both hugged me, held on like they were afraid I'd disappear again. And I let them, because for the first time in over a year, I felt like Arthur Sterling again. Not the broke man in Cicero, not the ghost with the secret fortune, just a father who'd fought his way back to his children. We made plans to have dinner the following week. Sophia wanted me to meet her boyfriend. Lucas wanted to show me his workshop, the new equipment he'd been able to buy with the investment money. They both wanted to introduce me to their lives, the parts I'd missed while I was gone. I said yes to all of it. But I also warned them that recovery wouldn't be instant. Trust, once broken, takes time to rebuild. We'd all been hurt. We'd all made mistakes. The road ahead would be difficult, but we'd walk it together. That was enough. The legal resolution took 6 months, but Jonathan had prepared me for that. The divorce was voided in August based on fraudulent evidence and concealment. Every asset was returned to my name. The 3 properties, the liquidated investment accounts, though Sebastian had spent enough of it that full recovery required seizing his assets too. The court ordered Vanessa to repay everything she'd received, but since most of it was gone, she'd be paying restitution for years. Sebastian's trial was scheduled for the following spring. Rebecca Torres expected multiple felony convictions. The notaries had taken plea deals and were testifying against him. His other victims had come forward now that someone was finally fighting back. The evidence was overwhelming. His legal career was over, his reputation destroyed, his freedom measured in years he'd spent in federal custody. Vanessa ended up in a studio apartment in Schaumburg, working retail to pay her legal fees. I heard about it from Sophia, who visited her mother once every few weeks out of obligation rather than love. The relationship was fractured, possibly beyond repair. Vanessa kept insisting she'd been manipulated by Sebastian too, that she didn't understand what she was doing. The recordings of her coaching sessions suggested otherwise. I didn't pursue additional charges against her. The federal case was enough. And honestly, watching her lose everything the way she'd watched me lose everything felt like sufficient justice. Sometimes karma doesn't need help. By December, I was back in the Lincoln Park house. It felt strange at first, walking through rooms where my marriage had died, where Sebastian and Vanessa had lived with my money. But Sophia helped me redecorate. We painted walls, replaced furniture, made it into something new rather than trying to resurrect what had been. Lucas and his girlfriend came over for Christmas. We cooked together, told stories, laughed about memories from before everything fell apart. Sophia brought her boyfriend, a quiet accountant who treated her well and didn't flinch when she explained why her father had been absent for a year. They were good people. My children had chosen well, despite everything. On Christmas Eve, after everyone had gone home, I sat alone in my renovated living room and thought about the journey that had brought me here. From that broke apartment in Cicero to this moment of peace, from complete despair to rebuilt family, from invisibility to visibility on my own terms. I thought about my grandfather Henry and his hidden account, the $127 million that had saved my life and given me the resources to fight back. I'd barely touched it during the legal battle. Jonathan's fees, the private investigators, the shell corporations to help Sebastian's other victims, and my own children. Maybe $5 million total. The rest sat waiting for purpose. That's when I made my final decision about the money. In January, I established the Henry Sterling Foundation with a $50 million initial endowment. Its mission, providing legal defense and financial support for victims of attorney fraud and family law manipulation. Free forensic accounting for men going through suspicious divorces. Grants for private investigators when the legal system fails. A network of pro bono attorneys willing to take on cases like mine. I recruited Rebecca Torres to serve on the board. She'd left the prosecutor's office to focus on reform work. Several of Sebastian's other victims joined as advisors. We built something that could prevent others from experiencing what we'd endured. The Foundation's first case came in February. A 68-year-old retired teacher in Milwaukee, whose attorney had fabricated evidence to help the teacher's wife seize his pension. The pattern was familiar. The template was Sebastian's. We deployed resources immediately, had the divorce stayed, hired proper representation, and began the investigation that would eventually expose the attorney's fraud. That man, whose name was Thomas, called me personally to say thank you, said he'd been considering suicide before our intervention, said he'd lost faith that anyone cared about men like him, men who'd worked their whole lives only to be discarded and exploited in their final years. I told him I understood because I'd been there, told him about sitting in that Cicero apartment wondering if the world had forgotten I existed, told him that sometimes survival is about lasting long enough for help to arrive. He asked what he could do to repay me. I said the same thing my grandfather had written in his letter. Rebuild, don't just destroy. Use your second chance to help someone else get theirs. By spring, the foundation had taken on 12 cases, helped 4 men recover stolen assets, exposed 2 more corrupt attorneys, connected victims with therapists who understood the specific trauma of family betrayal, built a community of survivors who reminded each other that being victimized didn't mean being weak. I met with each person we helped, listened to their stories, saw my own reflection in their eyes, and I understood what my grandfather had meant about empty plates and purpose. Revenge against Sebastian and Vanessa had been necessary, but it hadn't healed anything. Helping others heal was what finally gave meaning to everything I'd endured. Sophia joined the foundation's staff in June. She'd left the marketing firm to work on victim advocacy and fundraising. Said she wanted to spend her life making sure no one else's father went through what hers had. Lucas donated a percentage of his carpentry profits to the foundation each month. They'd both found ways to transform guilt into purpose. My relationship with them continued to deepen. Weekly dinners became routine. I attended Lucas's business expansion celebration, watched Sophia give a speech at a victims advocacy conference, met grandchildren I'd never known existed, slowly rebuilt the family that betrayal had broken. Not everything healed. There were still moments when I'd remember sitting in that apartment cold and hungry and forgotten. Still moments when I'd see Vanessa in passing and feel the ache of 35 years wasted. Still nights when I'd wonder if I could have fought harder earlier, prevented some of the damage. But mostly I felt peace. The kind of peace that comes from knowing you survived something designed to destroy you. From knowing your children loved you even after believing the worst. From knowing you'd taken your worst experience and transformed it into something that helped others. On the anniversary of finding my grandfather's account, I went back to that Cicero apartment building. Mrs. Rodriguez still lived in 3B. I knocked on her door and thanked her for the food she'd left, for the dignity she'd shown me when nobody else would. Told her about everything that had happened, about the foundation, about my family healing. She smiled and said she'd known I was going to be okay. Said she could tell by my eyes that I was a fighter, not a quitter. Said the world breaks everyone sometimes, but some people use the broken pieces to build something beautiful. I gave her an envelope with a check that would pay her rent for the next 10 years. She tried to refuse it, but I insisted. Told her that sometimes angels don't wear wings. They just leave plates of food by your door when you need them most. As I drove back to Lincoln Park that evening, the Chicago skyline glowing in the sunset, I thought about all the versions of myself I'd been over the past 3 years. The successful real estate investor, the destroyed divorce victim, the invisible man with a secret fortune, the father rebuilding his family, the foundation founder helping others survive. All of them were me. All of them were true. The betrayal and the recovery, the despair and the hope, the breaking and the rebuilding. My grandfather's letter had ended with instructions to rebuild rather than destroy. I'd done both, destroyed Sebastian's career and freedom because that was justice, rebuilt my family and helped others rebuild theirs because that was purpose. Now at 64, I finally understood what my grandfather had known, that money isn't power, knowledge isn't power. The real power comes from surviving the worst that life can throw at you and choosing to be better instead of bitter. They'd tried to bury me, my ex-wife, her attorney boyfriend, the system that enabled them. They'd taken everything and tried to erase me completely. But they'd forgotten something important. They'd forgotten that men like me, men who built lives from nothing, know how to rebuild. That men who survived decades of hard work and harder lessons don't quit just because someone knocked them down. That sometimes the most dangerous person isn't the one with the most money or the best lawyer, but the one who has nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. I didn't just survive, I won. And then I used that victory to make sure others could win too. If you're reading this from somewhere in the world where you feel invisible, where you've been betrayed, where you think nobody cares what happens to you, I need you to hear this. You matter. Your story isn't over. And sometimes the darkest moment comes right before you find the cigar box that changes everything. Keep fighting, keep rebuilding, and when you make it through to the other side, help someone else find their way. Because that's how we turn betrayal into legacy. That's how we make the worst chapters of our lives count for something. That's how we honor the grandfathers who hid accounts for us, the neighbors who leave food by our doors, and the children who find their way back even after believing lies. That's how we win. Where are you watching this from? Share your story in the comments. And if you know someone who needs to hear this, someone who's been knocked down and doesn't think they can get back up, share this with them. Because maybe, just maybe, they've got their own cigar box waiting to be found. They just need to survive long enough to open it. Hit subscribe if you want more stories about fighting back, rebuilding, and refusing to stay buried. I've got more to tell, and something tells me you've got more to hear. Until next time, remember, they can take your money, your house, your reputation, but they can't take who you are unless you let them. Don't let them.